So again, this is the second part of the three-part series, and this is going to be covering the solution. And what is the AA solution we have to offer? A spiritual experience. That's what we're looking for here. So we're going to do a little bit of a recap of some of the stuff that we did last week, near the end of the presentation last week. I want to start on page 164. Or I'm sorry, start on page 64. Get rid of the one, page 64. Because as we learned about the alcoholic illness, what we had found out in a lot of the presentation last week, especially most of it being in the doctor's opinion, we'd learned that we got this problem with the mind. We learned we got this problem with the body. We also learned that the crux of the problem between those two things is the mind, the obsession of the mind. Because if you don't put the first one in, if the mind does not fail, if the willpower does not fail to keep us in check, and we never pick up that first one, we don't have to worry about the allergic reaction of drinking more than we intend to because we'll never have the first one. So the crux was the mind. But then we find once we got to page 64, you get down to the last paragraph here, and we're going to drop down. Well, let's look at the second sentence in that last paragraph. It says, from its stem, all forms of spiritual disease. It says, for we have not only been mentally and physically ill, which is what we just discussed, the mental and physical aspect. Well, now we find out we've also been spiritually sick. So now we find a third prong to this illness, and that is a spiritual aspect. And then it says, and this is very important to highlight and underline, because this is how we're going to attack this three-prong deal. It says, when the spiritual malady is overcome, that's when we're going to straighten out mentally and physically. So how are we going to take care of this alcoholic obsession of the mind and the physical problem? By taking care of the spiritual malady. So we got to deal with this spiritual malady. And if you remember, we started the first session last week by looking at the second edition on page XV. And it kind of summarizes these first two parts of the problem and the solution on the last sentence on page XV. And it says, where Bill had been relieved of his drink obsession, the problem, the drink obsession, he'd been relieved of the drink obsession by what? A sudden spiritual experience. That was his solution, was to have a spiritual experience. That's what they're talking about here. So how do we take care of the spiritual malady? With a spiritual experience. That's what we're looking for. And then we turned again to page 44. And again, sorry, we will be doing a bit of jumping around here just to get this in line. On page 44, first paragraph, we want to look at the last sentence because I don't think I covered that last sentence last time. This is where we find those two questions to determine whether you're an alcoholic or not. But you know what? Let me just do the whole paragraph. It says in the preceding chapters, that's where you've learned something of alcoholism. So that's going to be everything preceding this chapter. And it says, we hope we've made clear the distinction between the alcoholic and the non-alcoholic. So that's where they summarize right here. Everything before chapter 4 is where you will have learned about the grave nature of alcoholism. That's where you learn about the illness. And then it says, of all the stuff that you learn there, we hope we've made clear one thing. Who's an alcoholic and who's not? According to Alcoholics Anonymous. What is an alcoholic? And they say, just ask yourself two questions. One, if when you honestly want to, you find you cannot quit entirely. Back to the question is something, and again, this if you're working with new people, it's this simple to turn to this page to help them understand whether they're an alcoholic or not. Because a lot of people do not know whether they are or not for sure. They think I got a lot of problems, but am I an alcoholic? Right? So here's the questions to self. Have you ever tried quitting? For good, honestly wanted to for good. Have you ever tried and found you couldn't? It's that simple. It says, if so, you're probably an alcoholic. That's question one. And then it says, or, doesn't say and. So you can answer yes to either one of these. Second one is if when you start drinking, you have little control over the amount you take. So what's the question there? You ever go out and just say, I'm only going to have 2 or 3 tonight? And end up having a lot more than you intend to? And ask yourself why. Do you remember the point when you said, I'm only going to have 3 tonight? And say you wound up blacking out and you wake up the next morning, whatever, just had way more than you intend to. Well, look back at that night and ask yourself, well, I remember saying I'm only going to have 3. Do I remember when I said, you know what, I think I'm going to have 30? Do you remember when you changed your mind and what the rationale was that said that that would be okay to do so? Because if not, there's something wrong there, right? There has to be a reason. But nonetheless, you want to know why? You got the other chapters to figure that out. But if you answer yes to either one of those, you're probably an alcoholic, according to Alcoholics Anonymous. Now, the next sentence. If that be the case that you answered yes to either one of those questions, the authors state you may be suffering from an illness. An illness, again, is a condition that prevents the normal functioning of the mind and or body. That's what this is, an illness. You may be suffering from an illness, which in their experience, only a spiritual experience will conquer. That's their experience. Only a spiritual experience. You remember, well, we didn't read it in the beginning this time, but we always read it in the beginning of our meetings in Ford First Edition, where it talks about who the authors are. It says, we of Alcoholics Anonymous are more than 100 men and women who have recovered from a seemingly hopeless state of mind and body. Well, how did it seem to be hopeless? When something seems to be hopeless, it means that you've tried everything you could and found, dang, I can't find a solution to this. That seems to be hopeless, right? And that's what they're saying here. Only in their experience, that's the only thing that worked for them, was to have the spiritual experience. Now, I also want to emphasize the fact that they do repeat a couple of times in this book that Alcoholics Anonymous does not state that we have the only solution for alcoholism. Okay. We don't know what other things may or may not work. All that we know is that we have a solution that worked for us when nothing else did. And so for new people, we say, if you have not found a solution to your problem and you're tired of looking for it and keep running around in this same cycle over and over and over, if you're done chasing around and you believe that this is a hopeless thing, that you can't get over this, well, we'll show you what we did. Because what we did, even back to when the authors wrote this, there were more than 100 people that wrote this, they said, man, rarely has anyone failed who's thoroughly followed our path. That sounds like pretty good odds, pretty good odds. So if you're out of solutions, this is the solution we have to offer. So this idea of a spiritual experience, that's what we're looking for. Note, they do not say anywhere in there anything that we've discussed so far about sobriety, sober as being a solution. And that counters a lot of things you may hear in a lot of other AA meetings, where we're here to get sober and we celebrate how long people have been sober and sober, and you got to be sober and stay sober. And no, sobriety is not our solution. Becoming sober, actually, it becomes a byproduct for us. We're going to see later. Actually, drinking became a byproduct from us. If you remember the doctor's opinion, when we talk about the cycle, where we start restless, irritable, and discontent, and we start thinking about the ease and comfort from drinking, because that is our solution to our restless, irritable, and discontentedness, is to drink. It is a byproduct. It is not the problem. It starts with this restless, irritable, and discontentedness. Why, when we're sober, are we restless, irritable, and discontent and constantly thinking about, I need a drink to make me feel better? That's the solution. This becomes a byproduct. Sober is the same thing. Sobriety is the same thing. It becomes a byproduct. And we're going to see that. It's not just me saying this. We're going to see that as we go along. But I want to tell you, first off, what does sober mean by definition? You guys didn't get this last week. It's a good thing to know. It's a very good thing to know. Sober in 2 words, Paul?
Not drunk.
Not drunk. It's 2 words. If you look it up in Webster's, sober means not drunk. That's it. And if you think that's a solution, I'll ask you this. If you come to your first meeting and you're dragging your butt through that door, which I know if you come into this meeting, I haven't met a person yet who said, I just come here to see how the other half lives. I've never seen that yet. You know, I haven't seen that. We're usually we might look like we're walking through, but we're dragging through here, right? So when we're dragging ourselves through here, most of us, not all, but most of us are actually not drunk at our first meeting. So if not drunk is the solution, what are you doing here? You're already not drunk. You've solved your problem, right? That's not the solution for us, because when we're sober, we're miserable. That's the problem. And then we go to drinking. So let's just see what the book has to say. That's the definition. Let's see what the book has. A couple of things to say about this idea of sober, because I want to get it through your heads that sober, according to Alcoholics Anonymous, is not the solution. So a little bit what we covered last week too, but back on page 19, the first thing, now Bill is very creative in his writing. He was the primary author of this book. And he says, when Bill starts talking about things, a lot of times he'll say the same thing. We'll find, like, you can find, whenever we get into a topic, I can say, you can find it on this page, you can find it on this page, you can find it on this page, and they all reinforce each other. But a lot of times he uses different words, but it's still meaning the same thing. So we're going to take sober. And let's look at the first paragraph on page 19 and look at the third line down. And that's where he says, we feel that the elimination of drinking is but a beginning. Elimination of drinking would be a synonym for sober. If you're not drinking, then you are now sober. They're saying that is just the beginning. If you're sober and you have not had a spiritual experience, then it's either, I heard somebody, maybe one or two people here say that they're recovering. Hopefully, if you're sober, you're recovering, right? Meaning that you're working through the steps to have the spiritual experience so that you can become recovered. Hopefully you're recovering. But if not, if you're not working those steps, you've been around 10, 15 years, and I have done this and just say, that's all you're doing is just staying sober and going to meetings. Even after 10 or 15 or 20 years, according to Alcoholics Anonymous, you still just made a beginning. You've just made a beginning. Doesn't matter how long you've been sober. In fact, it can be a long, miserable beginning, because remember, when we're sober, we're restless, irritable, and discontent. We start thinking about drinking, and then we drink. Well, if you wait a month, like a lot of people who come in and end up relapsing, it usually, from my experience, seeing people, it's usually within the first year, they'll end up going back out again if they're not doing this work. And so they're miserable for whatever period of time, a month, 3 months, 6 months, a year, whatever it is. And then they go get their relief from the drink. And then they get beat down some more. But can you imagine going 10 years without drinking and not being recovered? That means you're constantly miserable and thinking about a drink for 10 years. That is a very miserable beginning, long beginning that you made. Now, I also want to look a little further. If we look at page 82, we covered this a little last week as well. Last paragraph on 82, drop down 1, 2, 3, 4 lines, where it says selfish and inconsiderate habits have kept the home in turmoil. We're going to talk a little bit about that next week. But the next sentence says that we feel a man is unthinking when he says sobriety is enough. Sobriety is not enough. It is just a beginning. It's highlighting the same concept, right? Now, let's just look at that even a little deeper. It's just a beginning. It's not enough. And now what do they say on page 122 about this? Last paragraph on page 122, this here they say cessation of drinking. That means not drinking. That means sober. Same thing. Cessation of drinking. Well, that's just the first step away from a highly strained and abnormal condition. It is just a beginning. It is not enough. In fact, you're only one step away from that highly strained and abnormal condition in our lives, in our homes, in our workplaces. It's all still very highly strained in an abnormal condition. We're only one step away from it, even if you're sober for 10 years. Do we understand what they're getting at with that? What they're really getting at is you're still restless, irritable, and discontent if you're only sober, no matter how long you've been sober for. So that clearly is not our solution. It does not work. Why? Because of our cycle. Back to the doctor's opinion. We always come back to where we end up picking up the drink. We end up drinking more than we intend to. We end up going through that, what do they call it? The spree, drinking more than we intend to. And then we emerge remorseful and we have this firm resolution, I'll never do it again. And then we're sober. And then we get miserable again. And then we start thinking about drinking. We keep going through this over and over and over. The only way to stop that cycle, it's not by, a lot of people think it's by that second part, or I'm sorry, the third part. First is we're miserable thinking about drinking. First is we're miserable. Second, we think about drinking. And third is then we pick up that first drink. And a lot of people, even in AA, think, well, we got to tackle that third part. Just don't pick up that first drink. Well, if you don't, then you're stuck in the cycle. What's previous to that is I'm sober and I'm miserable and I'm thinking about a drink and I'm just trying like hell not to pick up that first one. That doesn't work. The way to break the cycle is right at the beginning. See, if I'm not restless, irritable, and discontent and miserable in this highly strained and abnormal condition, which makes me think about that first drink, if I can simply be sober and happy, I'll never be thinking about something to make me feel better because I already feel better. Breaks the whole cycle. That's what we're looking to do. And that's why we're looking to break that third prong here. So it's not enough. So, and again, let's just summarize this. Again, we covered this last week on page 25. I think this is kind of how we ended it. Last paragraph on 25 says, if you're as serious an alcoholic as we were, we believe there's no middle of the road solution. We're talking about a solution here, no middle of the road, which means this is not cafeteria style, take what you want and leave the rest, which you might hear sometimes. That is not how this works. It says, we were in a position where life was becoming impossible. Notice they're not saying anything about drinking. This is that highly strained abnormal condition where life was becoming impossible. Our life, as we see in step one, was becoming unmanageable that we talked last week. It was becoming impossible. And if we pass through that region for which there is no return through human aid, then we had but two alternatives. Door number one was to go to the bitter end, blocking out our consciousness, our intolerable situation as best we could. Or door number two is to accept this spiritual help. And then we come into what some people have as a problem. Chapter 4 is all about this problem where some people have a problem accepting the spiritual help. Because if we're going to have the spiritual experience, we're going to have spiritual help to get it. We're going to come back to that in a minute. But I guess the thing that I want to point out is we had found on page 48 where we talked about this last week. I'm not going to go back there now, but it's about the OSUPs. That's the thing that can get in our way of accepting this spiritual help. And that's people that have had a problem with this idea of God. When we're talking about spiritual, we're going to be talking about God. We have a whole chapter to cover that. And it could be because of, they tell us of, certain impression of God that was imposed on them when they were younger that they rejected, and now they have this bristling effect whenever. Bill was one of them. Bill's story talks a lot about it. In fact, they said that more than half of the original members, more than 100 men and women that wrote that, more than half of them were either atheists or agnostic. Okay? And what they say is that the only thing that's going to handicap you from having this spiritual experience is having this obstinacy, sensitiveness, or unreasoning prejudice about the idea of God. I don't want to hear about it. No, don't talk to me about that. If that's where you're at, there's nothing more that AA can offer you. It's that simple. We can't sugarcoat it. That's the only thing that we have to offer, right? And the only thing that gets us past that, and you'll see it in Bill's story. In Bill's story, he spends like 3 pages talking about this, going back and forth, this idea God wanted nothing to do with it, and the way he was raised as his grandfather and wants nothing to do with it. But then the doctor told me I'm going to die. And I'm looking at Evie, and he said he recovered by having this idea of God, but I want nothing to do with it. And he plays this back and forth. What breaks that is enough pain. We talked about that before. When we get beat into a state of reasonableness, we have to get to that point before we're going to be willing to accept that spiritual help. So now let's go on and talk about what is a spiritual experience, because that's what we're looking to have, right? How do we define that? What is a spiritual experience? It's the only time I go outside the first portion of the book, the first 196 pages. If you turn to page 567, and the reason I go here is this appendix was written. They wrote the first edition in April of 1939. They had several reprintings of it when they needed more books, but right in their second reprinting, they realized we got to change something, because Bill's story talked about this sudden spiritual experience that happened to him. And people were writing in saying, Bill, we're doing all this work and we're not having this sudden spiritual experience, the blinding light and all that. Some have, but many haven't. So what do you mean by this? So they want to clarify what the spiritual experience is. And I'm glad they did. It's very important for us to know. So on page 569, or is it 560, 567?
Yeah, that's it.
Yeah, 567. Top of the page, it's called spiritual experience. So we're on the right path. The term spiritual experience and spiritual awakening, which is interesting because on step 12 here, they call it spiritual awakening. But in the book, we've been reading spiritual experience. What's the difference? Nothing. Both those terms are used many times in this book, which upon careful reading shows that, I would highlight and underline this because this is their definition of a spiritual experience. Personality change, sufficient to bring about recovery from alcoholism. It is a personality change, a change in our personality, but not just a change in our personality, but it's got to be so strong of a change that it is sufficient to bring about recovery from alcoholism. A very big, massive change. How big and massive? Well, they don't tell us that, but if we go back to page 27, see where this is before Bill got involved. Remember, Bill got these concepts from Ebby, his buddy Ebby, who got them from the Oxford group, who really, well before that, before the person who hooked up these ideas for alcoholism with the Oxford group, his name was Roland Hazard. Okay, and that was back in 1922 is when he went to see this Dr. Jung overseas. I believe we covered that a little bit before. But this guy had a lot of money, this Roland Hazard. He said he had the money, if money could buy a solution to his alcoholic problem, he would have had it taken care of. Okay, he's from the States. He flew or not flew because they didn't fly then. He took a boat all the way over to Europe, and he spent a full year with the third most prominent psychologist in the world. A whole year he got with this guy, meeting with him once or twice a week for a year to try to get this thing under control. And it says on page 26 where he says he believed he'd acquired such a profound knowledge of the inner workings of his mind and his hidden springs that relapse was unthinkable. It says, nevertheless, he was drunk in a short time. As the story goes, he headed back, the next day to get back on the boat to head back to the U.S. and never made it to the boat. And he was drunk after spending a year there. So he goes back to the doctor, and he says, is there, what's the deal? Basically, why did this happen? And the doctor told him, you have the mind of a chronic alcoholic. That's what I found out about you. And I've never seen one single one recover. And if that would have been the end of that conversation, we wouldn't have been sitting here today right now. You know what? But Roland asked him, he said, are there no exceptions? That's at the top of page 27. Is there no exceptions to this? He said, well, actually, yes, there are. And that's when we get into, let's see, 1, 2, 3, the fourth paragraph on page 27 starts with yes. Yes, replied the doctor, there is. Exceptions to such cases as yours have been occurring since early times. He says here and there, once in a while, and put that in a time context, since early times. So we could be going back thousands of years. They know that these things have happened. And over these thousands of years, only every once in a while. So what, maybe every few hundred years? This isn't like, well, every month or so this happens. This is like every once in a great while this seems to happen, where alcoholics have had what are called vital spiritual experiences. That word vital again, does anybody remember the definition of vital? Necessary for life. So they had these spiritual experiences. He says, to me, these occurrences are phenomena. Phenomena means that he just doesn't understand how they work. But they appear to be in the nature. So remember when we just read that we have to have a personality change that's strong enough to bring about recovery. This is what the doctor says it looks like. This personality change, he says, they're huge emotional displacements and rearrangements. Ideas, emotions, and attitudes, which were once the guiding forces of these men's lives, are suddenly cast to one side, and a completely new set of conceptions and motives begin to dominate them. That's what we're talking about. A complete 180 of our ideas, emotions, and attitudes. That's our personality. In fact, that is our entire life. Everything that we do, think about it. Every action, like you look at our life becoming unmanageable. We dig into that. It's because of actions that we have taken, right? Well, all action is born in thought. We don't take any action without thinking first. It might not even be conscious action. When you just picked up that cup, you did not think to yourself, I need to pick up this cup and be careful not to drink it, did you? You're just listening to me and you picked it up and it almost seemed like you didn't think about it. But there's thought that happens before we do something, whether it's conscious or unconscious. All action is born in thought. Ideas come from our thought. Emotions affect our thoughts and our decisions on how we're going to act. And our attitudes, based on all of that, affects the way we think, the way that we perceive things, and then the way we're going to react. All of our actions are based on our ideas, emotions, and attitudes. Those need to be turned. That means it's not our actions that need to be turned around. And we find that later when you get into looking at steps 6 and 7 about taking care of our character defects. And I just love it when I hear people at meetings say, I'm working on my character defects today. We don't have the power to do that. That's why it says in 7, we're asking God to remove them. We don't do that. We don't have control over our actions. Keep trying. Keep trying to make your life manageable. Keep trying. It doesn't work. Believe me, I tried for a long time, sober. It doesn't work. It doesn't work. So we don't try to change our actions. The spiritual experience, the ideas and emotions and attitudes, the way we're thinking is what needs to be changed. How do we do that? That's what we're trying to get down to. So we get into looking at, they said back on page 48, or what was it, 48 or 64, the three-prong illness, they said that we have a spiritual illness now, right? And the spiritual malady needs to be overcome. Well, what is the spiritual malady? What do you mean by a spiritual malady? What is the spiritual problem? We know the mind is that obsession. We know the body is the allergy. What is this spiritual malady? Well, we find that back again on page 62. Our spiritual malady. What is the problem? First paragraph on 62, again, selfishness and self-centeredness, that is the root of our troubles. That's where all of this stems from, the root. Selfish and self-centeredness comes from within, comes out in actions in selfish and self-centered ways, ends up making our life unmanageable. We try controlling everybody and everything around us to suit us, to get our rest satisfaction out of life. And in doing so, we step on the toes, I believe it says, of others, and they retaliate, and then we get angry, and we get miserable, and we get restless, irritable, and get discontent, and we start thinking about the sense of ease and comfort that's going to come from just a few drinks, right? Stems from selfishness, self-centeredness. Next paragraph says, above everything, we alcoholics, we must be rid of this selfishness. We must, or it kills us. It's a very important statement. How are we going to get rid of that? That's the spiritual. Are we connecting the dots here? Spiritual experience is what's going to take care of that, because it says right before the last paragraph, neither could we reduce our self-centeredness by the wishing method or by our own willpower. So we could wish to be less selfish. We could wish it away. And we can use our own willpower and try to be less selfish to get rid of it. But it is not going to produce the spiritual experience necessary to be able to recover from alcoholism. We don't have the power to do it. That's why we need to have the spiritual experience through God. So that's the problem. Now our solution, again, if you go up to page 14, again, this is all repeated over and over. First paragraph on 14, this is our solution as we start putting this together. How do we get the spiritual experience? Well, we're going to take this in bits and pieces. It says, simple but not easy, a price had to be paid. It meant the destruction of self-centeredness. The destruction of self-centeredness. That's the price we have to pay. That means what I want at any given moment, I need to let it go. I need to let it go. I don't run the show anymore. This is leading up to step 3. That is how we destroy self-centeredness. It says, I must turn in, we're going to come back to this, I must turn in all things to the Father of light that presides over us. Turn in all things, everything. I don't make the decisions for my life anymore. When I do, my life's unmanageable. I am just as powerless over managing my life as I am over alcohol. That's what we have to begin to understand here. It's a big shift from the idea of thinking that sobriety is all we need. But again, if you're able to get rid of the selfishness, then your life will become your life will change and start to become manageable. And you'll start to be able to get this sense of being sober and being happy. And therefore, not thinking about the sense of ease and comfort, and therefore never picking up the drink. There's never that if you remember on page 24, where we just, at certain times, the mental problem, this obsession that I need this drink, and finally I don't even reflect on the consequences. Today, I always reflect on the consequences. I never have to, but I know for me it's poison. I just know it is. I don't care if you drink or anybody else drinks. I'm not saying it's poison for you, just for me it is. It would be just the same as anybody has an allergy to milk, and I'm like, oh my God, he drinks milk. You know, you don't do that, or I can't be around that guy. He's a milk drinker. We don't do that, right? It's just sane, sound thinking, right? That's what happens, sanity. And we'll come back to that too. So the question is, we know we need to get a spiritual experience. The question is, where do we get the spiritual experience? How do we get the spiritual experience? How does that happen? How do we get this to where our ideas, emotions, and attitudes change? It just told us we don't have the power to do it. So how do we get it? You can ask, but be careful who you ask, because let me give you a couple answers that I've found that people have given that I can tell you you're not going to find it. You're not going to find it on Amazon. You're not going to find it on Shopify. You're not going to find it at Walmart. Okay. It's not something you're going to be able to buy or pick up. And you know what? It also doesn't rub off. Stick around the winners in AA and like it rubs off on you. That does not happen either. I can assure you that's not going to happen. That's not how it works. It's not how we get it. The way we get it is AA, luckily, when they're offering a solution of a spiritual experience, they also offer how to get it. If you remember, the book is entitled Alcoholics Anonymous, and on the title page it says, this is the story of how many thousands of men and women have recovered. This is how. In this book, we'll show how. Top of page 29 says, we're going to give you clear-cut directions, clear-cut, showing how we recover. They say in forward to first edition, the reason we wrote this book is to show you precisely how we recovered. Precise, clear-cut directions. I guess at that point, if you're new, how important do you think it is to have this book? Where else are you going to get these clear-cut, precise directions? From 20 different opinions in a meeting? Right? So let's look at it. What is a program? I love using the dictionary. What is a program? Because AA says it has a program. Why do they use the word program? This is very interesting. If you don't know anything about the book, most people in AA, the vast majority, they know about those because they see them in the meetings all the time, right? Got these 12-step posters everywhere. Get this, a program is defined in Webster's as a series of actions designed to achieve a, meaning one specific result. Series of actions. What results are we looking for here? Well, number 12, what does it say? Oh, we had a spiritual awakening as a result of doing all the other ones. That's our result we're looking for. AA has a program, series of actions designed to give us a spiritual experience. Not just for alcoholics, by the way, right? Our way of living has its advantages for anyone and everyone. None of us are beyond selfishness and self-centeredness, and none of us are beyond the way that we inflict pain and suffering on other people as a result of our selfishness and self-centeredness, including upon ourselves. We're not just unique in that regard. So really, this we talk about the program, and we talk about a program of action. And it's also called, I think on page 25, the spiritual toolkit that we have. This program of action is actually steps 3 through 9. Step 1 was, we kind of covered a little bit, and we covered a lot last week, but step 1 is just determining whether you're an alcoholic or not. We found on page 44, if you want to find that out, read everything prior to chapter 4. Then you just say yes or no. That's all there is to it. And then step 2 is, are you even willing to believe that there's a God? You don't have to believe in one, just are you willing? Which willing just simply means, are you willing to do this work and see if you get the results? Because if you did, then it's probably from a God. Are you willing to try that? But if it's, I ain't even going to, well, then there's nothing we can do for you, right? But the spiritual toolkit, I think we find on page 25, says here at the top of the page, first paragraph, it's probably good to cover this since we're in this session called The Solution. The first paragraph on 25 says there is a solution. And again, we don't need the dictionary for the word A. It's one. AA is one solution. And now we're going to get a little bit more into what are these clear-cut directions about. They're going to summarize it again. It says almost none of us like the self-searching. Almost none of us like the leveling of pride. And almost none of us like the confession of shortcomings, which the process requires. Require is the same as must. It is required for its successful consummation. You want to have a spiritual experience, you want to have a successful consummation of that, it is required that there is some self-searching, there's going to be leveling of pride, and there's going to be confession of shortcomings. Oh, and by the way, almost none of them like doing it. It's not a fun thing to go through, but it is required in order to have this happen. And they say, but we really saw it work in others. And that's why we have meetings for people who have recovered and people who are not recovered, still suffering, saying, I don't want to do it, but man, that guy looks pretty darn happy. Maybe I can get that if I do what he did. Maybe. That's why we see it working in others. And if we've come to believe in the hopelessness and futility of life as we've been living it, when therefore we were approached by those who the problem has been solved, that we'll be covering next week. Who approaches who in there? It says when we, being the ones that are sick, are being approached by the ones who the problem have been solved, that would be the recovered ones approaching the ones that are sick, not the other way around. Then there's nothing for us, the newcomer, to do but to pick up the simple kit of spiritual tools laid at our feet. We're going to cover that in detail next week. That is our job, if you're recovered, is to simply lay the spiritual kit of tools at their feet. What is that? This is how I got well. Let me show you what I did. Let me not give you my opinion. Let me not try to guide your life and tell you what you need to do. Let me just show you what's in here. Clear-cut directions. That's all we do. That's how clear-cut this is. And the spiritual toolkit, the three things we just read about, the program of action, you would think that that's a big thing because that's the solution here, right? And we found out that with the doctor's opinion, we have 12 chapters in this book I mentioned last week. And the first 4 of those chapters, 1/3 of the book, only covered step 1. That took up a lot of it, a third. Well, now we're talking about all this work we got to do to have the spiritual experience. Do you know that's only covered in 3 chapters? 4, 5, and 6. That's all our clear-cut directions. You're going to find it just in that short period of time. But our goal here is actually to put what we see in step 3 into action. Because step 3 simply says that we're making a decision. It doesn't say we're doing this. We're going to make a decision to turn our will and life over to the care of God. It doesn't say we do it. Do you know why it doesn't say we do it? Because if you follow it through in chapter 5, you're going to find out that we can't do it. We can't turn our will and life over to the care of God. We don't have the power to do that. We are blocked from God. That's the problem. The goal is to relieve enough selfishness and self-centeredness to where we can get an open communication and a relationship with God so he can guide our lives. That's the goal, is to make that happen. It's to get us returned to sanity, to recover, so that we can actually, our will, as it turns out, they say our will is our actions. Our will is our thoughts, because they're guided by, our thoughts is our will, and our lives are accumulation of our actions. So it's going to be, our thoughts and our actions are going to be God's. I'm not going to think how I'm going to run my life, and I'm not to take actions to try to run my life. Because every time I do, what happens? I get miserable, and then I start drinking, and we keep going through this over and over again. So I want to turn to page 60 here, because when we get to step 3, there's a few prerequisites here on page 60. And you guys may have seen this a lot, where in most other meetings they read how it works, that laminated version of how it works. Somebody read how it works. At the very end of it, they cover this A, B, and C thing. You guys may have heard of it, right? You want to look at these. These are your prerequisites for 3. It says on page 60, right before the paragraph before A, B, and C, it says, our description of the alcoholic. Well, what's that? That's the first 3 chapters in the doctor's opinion. That's their description of the alcoholic. The chapter to the agnostic, that's step 2, which is chapter 4. And our personal adventures before and after, that's going to be the case studies that they've had throughout it. It says that they make clear 3 pertinent ideas. A, that we were alcoholic and could not manage our own lives. If you want to know if you're ready to take these next steps, these are the questions to ask yourself. Have you determined that you're an alcoholic and can't manage your own life? That's a big piece. Can't manage my own life. Have you got that? B, have you also come to concede to the fact that no human power could relieve your alcoholism? Church isn't going to do it. Psychology, psychiatrists, treatment centers. Have you come to determine, not even AA meetings, because it's full of people, that's a human solution. Do you understand there's no human solution? That's a requirement before we move on. And then the last one is that God could and would if he were sought. Have you conceded to that? Well, if I don't have a conception of God, how can I concede to that? It's real simple. I had it pointed out to me. It's very simple, because I was one that I didn't know where it was. So my mentor said, well, you know about me, and I tell you that God did for me what I couldn't do for myself, brought me to where I am today. If you like what you see, Do you think that I'm lying to you? No, it kind of makes sense. I'll take it for what it is and I'll try it. That's what Ebby did with Bill. Told him exactly the same thing, point blank. But he told it point blank in a little different way when he said, I got religion. We don't do that. That really set Bill off in, in the wrong direction. But nonetheless, God could and would if he were sought. So those are your prerequisites. Then we get into the first requirement for step 3 is 2 paragraphs down. Because there's actually some work we do in step 3. It's not just making a decision. And it says here, the first requirement, something we're going to have to do. And that is that we be convinced that any life run on self-will can hardly be a success. Are you convinced of that? And we ain't talking about drinking anymore. Are you convinced that any life run on self-will, when I run it, I destroy it? Am I convinced of that? That's the first thing that we need to figure out for step 1. So the question is, match that up with your own experience, because I can tell you that pretty much every alcoholic that I've ever met who's conceded to this, they come in here because their life's a mess, and the ones that got well have conceded it's because they run their life on self-will. That's why we drag ourselves through the floor. So what does it mean to have this unmanageable life? If you turn to page 52, second full paragraph, 3 lines down. Here's what an unmanageable life looks like. And all you got to do is answer yes to any one of these to have an unmanageable life. So just ask yourself, we were having trouble with personal relationships. And notice none of this is going to be about drinking. Anybody come in here having problems with their personal relationships? Damn much every one of us, right? We couldn't control our emotional natures. We were a prey to misery and depression. We couldn't make a living. We had a feeling of uselessness. We were full of fear. We were just unhappy. We couldn't seem to be of real help to other people. Those are all symptoms of what an unmanageable life looks like. And that is a result of living life on self-will. And back to, we have to be beaten into the state of reasonableness in order to take on this idea of turning our will and our life over to the care of God. Because what this ends up doing, yes, while we go through step 9 to have the spiritual experience, we're going to find next week, we have to keep doing things in order to keep that. While we do recover, we become recovered. In order to stay that way, there's work that we have to continue to do. This is a lifetime thing that we're going to be looking at doing here. This is not just, through 9. But we do steps 4 through 9 again to remove enough of the selfishness to let him in. And then we're doing 10 through 12, where we start doing step 3. We're turning our will and life over to the care of God. If I'm going to turn my thoughts and my actions to the care of God, that means I'm going to align my will with God's will. In other words, whatever he wants me to do, that's what I'm going to do. I'm not going to do what I want to do. Well, here's a question. How do I know what he wants me to do? I'm going to have to ask, right? I'm going to have to listen. I'm going to have an open channel. And that's what we're going to start learning about next week in steps 10 and 11, exactly how to do that, exactly how to make that connection and do that every day. But what will happen at the end of the day, this is what it'll look like on the top of page 63. And I love this summary. This is how this deal works in step 3 with God. 3 lines down, it says, being all powerful, he, being God, he's going to provide what we need. If, and I'd circle that word if, because that's the top of 63. He's going to provide what we need. That means God's going to provide everything we need. Everything. If something we have to do, we're going to need to keep close to him, and we're going to need to perform his work well. We're going to see that being in 10:11. That's what we have to do. It's a 2-part deal. He will provide what we need as long as we do this. The less that we're providing the less that we're keeping close to him, and the less that we're performing his will, well, the less he's going to provide what we need. And if he's not providing what we need, who's providing what we need? I am. And how's that work out? Not too well. So I kind of want us to look at it like this. we're going to see that there's some things they tell us about, because I think one of the misconceptions maybe I had, and maybe some others may have, and I don't know in this room if any of you guys had thought this, but if you've gotten an understanding of this well enough to know that you recover, and I guess I can get an explaining for certain in a minute here what that means to recover. But once you recover in step 9, this idea that you can revert back. Okay. And it doesn't necessarily mean that you can just go back to drinking, because I'm an example. And in the book, they show us examples of sometimes that doesn't even happen. We can just pull our own will back after having recovered. If you remember, we saw, I think on page 14, Bill just recovered, had this great sudden spiritual experience. I mean, he was blown away by it. And then on the next page, he says, I wasn't too well at the time. I was plagued by waves of depression. And he was all messed up very shortly thereafter because he wasn't helping others. And it says later that, but I found when I started working with others, I was amazingly lifted up. So there's stuff that we have to do or we will revert back. Bill didn't go back to drinking. Bill just got restless, irritable, and discontent. Got really miserable. Now, what do you have drank? I can't tell you. They tell us in the book, most do, but you may not. And I can't tell you if going back to drinking is worse than not going back to drinking if you're an alcoholic, because it led me, again, 15, 16 years sober, with a gun to my head ready to blow my brains out. Because drinking, the obsession to drink had been removed from me, but I wasn't doing this 10, 11, and 12. I wasn't doing the continued work. I went to meetings, but I wasn't doing the work. But I was so miserable. But drinking, it wasn't an option. That honestly had been removed. The obsession had been removed. So what was I left with for a solution? It was to live miserable, going to the bitter end, blotting out my intolerable situation as much as that's really all I had. Or check out. That's a terrible place to be. And it's a danger that I don't want to see anybody get into. So this is, I kind of like looking at this like diabetes. Okay. I'm a diabetic and I kind of made this connection. It's like with any illness, with diabetes, you're going to start with having some kind of symptoms. You know, maybe you're getting up at night and having to pee a lot, or there's different symptoms that you may have. So you go to your doctor, so you know what's going on. And your doctor's going to run some tests. First off, you always go to a doctor, which is why we got a doctor opinion here. But they're going to run some tests, and they'll come back and say, oh, I know exactly what's wrong with you. You have diabetes. And then you're like, if you're like I was, you're like, oh crap, I didn't know anything about that. I'm going to die. That's what I heard. I heard you're dying. That's what I heard. He said, no. People live very happy, normal lives with this. What we're going to do is we're going to give you a program. It may include some exercise, proper diet, some medications. But as long as you follow this regimen or this program, as long as you do that, then your symptoms are going to go away. And when your symptoms go away, you can live a very happy, healthy life. You'll always be diabetic, but all those symptoms will be gone. Okay, you'll live a good, happy, healthy life. However, if you decide later, boy, I feel so good. God, I hate taking medication. You know, I'm not going to take that anymore. Stop doing that. And I can start eating like this again. And, I'm not feeling, and you start doing those things again. What's going to happen with your symptoms? They're going to come back. They're going to come back. And if I keep doing and going on that way, what's going to happen? I'm going to die. Slow killer, but I'm going to die. I don't look at this a whole lot differently than that. We got a program outlined for us to do. And the danger becomes when we start feeling really well after we have the spiritual experience. Life gets good. You guys have heard the promises being read at meetings, right? Find a new happiness, no matter how far down the scale we've gone, blah, blah, blah. But life is great, right? And when life starts feeling great, we start having a whole lot less time for other things, like working with other people, especially because that's very inconvenient, right? And time in the morning with God when I've got, this baseball practice to go to with my kid and I get this going on. It's got things going on. I got a life now, man. I don't need to get that much better. The problem is we don't stay there. That's the misconception. We don't just stay here where I can say, well, yeah, if I really, really dug into this and became like a monk, then I could get a lot better. I'm good here. This is nice. But the problem is we don't stay there. It's like a downward escalator, moving slowly down. I have to keep doing work just to stay here. That's what we have to understand. If you look, I want to cover real quick what it is to be recovered. Well, what is recovered? To be returned to a normal state of health after an illness. An illness is defined as a condition that prevents the normal functioning of the mind and or body. We have a condition of the mind and the body. The crux of the problem, again, is the mind. What do we recover? Well, what's the problem with the mind? Covered last week. Step 2, the sanity. Step 2 says that we're coming to believe that there's a power that can restore me to sanity. Restore my sanity. Well, what is the insanity? The insanity is the insanity of the first drink. It's very specific what they mean about that. It is the page 24. Describes the insanity of the first drink, where we do not reflect on the consequences at certain times and we pick it back up again. Even when we try to quit, we pick it up and like, how did that happen? Why did I relapse again? Because I didn't reflect on the consequences. That is the insanity. Okay. And that's what puts us beyond human aid. I can't stop me from drinking. Nobody else can either. Beyond human aid. That is the insanity. Hopeless condition. When we have this personality change happen from doing all of these things with these character defects and stuff that seem to have nothing to do with drinking, the byproduct of it comes in 2 forms. One is the way we feel, and I'm not going to go over the promises now. You guys can look at that yourself back on page 83, I think it is, 83 and up to the top of 84. That's how great we feel. But let's talk about this insanity. What happens with this obsession of the mind when they say the alcoholic mind is removed? We're recovered. What does that mean? What did we recover? We recover our sanity. And this is, you look at the last paragraph on 84. We should be reading this as well in the promises in the beginning of meetings, because this is the other piece. This is why people, I do believe, and it was for me for certain, why I went to meetings for decades saying I'm a recovering alcoholic, constantly in the state of recovery. I'm constantly recovering. I never get well. Right? Well, that's not what they say here. It says at this point, and by the way, this is halfway through step 9, which is when we will have recovered, it tells us. And we have ceased fighting anything or anyone, even alcohol. For by this time, sanity will have returned, restored to sanity. We will seldom be interested in liquor, and if tempted, we're going to recoil from it as if from a hot flame. We react sanely and normally, and we find this happens automatically. We will see that our new attitude towards liquor has been given us without any thought or effort on our part. See, we don't try controlling our drinking. We don't try to avoid places and people that drink or anything like that. It just happens. It says it just comes. That's the miracle of it. We're not fighting it, and we're not even avoiding temptation. We feel as though we've been placed in a position of neutrality, safe and protected. We have not even sworn it off. See, I don't even have a choice whether I drink today. I don't swear. This becomes a byproduct of good living, right? That creates bad living. I don't want that, right? So I keep doing what I do. We've not even sworn it off. I would highlight and underline this. Instead, the problem has been removed. The alcoholic mind has been removed. The problem, the insanity, it's removed. It does not exist for us. We are neither cocky nor are we afraid. That is our experience, and that is how we react so long as we keep in fit spiritual condition. Uh-oh. It doesn't say we stay like that. We're going to need to keep in fit spiritual condition. We will be looking at that a little bit next week, but I want to look at 2 things real quick. The next statement, after all this great stuff happens, it's easy to let up on the spiritual program of action and rest on our laurels. We're headed for trouble if we do, for alcohol is a subtle foe. We are not cured of alcoholism, right? What we have is a daily reprieve contingent on our maintenance of our spiritual condition, fitness of our spiritual condition. What does that mean? Page 13 and 14 will sum it up. I'm sorry, bottom of page 14, last sentence. This will kind of sum it up, and I think we went over this a little bit last week. This is once we recovered. It says, if an alcoholic failed to perfect and enlarge his spiritual life, its spiritual condition, enlarge it and perfect it, how? Through work and self-sacrifice for others, he could not survive the certain trials and low spots that lie ahead. you're not going to survive this, and they're certain to come. There's going to be low points, and you're not going to survive them. You will drink again. That's what it says. If he does not work, he would surely drink again, and if he drank, he would surely die. Then faith would be dead indeed. And with us, it's just like that. And the last thing I want to hit on is page 20, where they actually dig this in a little deeper. The first sentence, full sentence on page 20 says, our very lives as ex-problem drinkers, if you're recovered, your life depends upon our constant thought of others and how we might help meet their needs. Constant thought. That's what we're going to get into next week. We must do this work or we're going to die, is what this tells us, if you're alcoholic. And we will stop right there.